So, welcome to the IMBIS Ask Me Anything series 2023. The AMA series is presented by the International Mind, Brain, and Education Society. And if you're not sure what mind, brain education is, we're going to talk about that. But the aim here is to build connections among IMBIS trainees and non-trainee practitioners and researchers to support the translation of research into policy and practice. It's also an effort for us to expand our community and welcome new faces and new names into this space. So if this is your first IMBIS event, we're really glad that you're here. And if you have any ideas for future speakers you'd like to see, please get in touch. So we'll introduce ourselves. My name is Chris Simmers. I'm the current, one of the co-presidents for the IMBIS Trainee Board. And we should have two other board members here. Flor, would you like to unmute and introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Floor. I'm working in the lab of Bert de Smet in Leuven. So I'm from Belgium and I'm the social media representative of the IMBES board. And I was just, Chris, I don't think I can see or I can add people. Could that be?
Oh, in the participants are getting added.
Yeah, so I cannot admit people.
Yes, I need to make you a co-host.
Maybe.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're missing Sarah Gilmore, who is our master of show here. So bear with us 1 second. Got it. So now we'll have a flood of people coming in.
Yes,
okay.
Perfect.
Thank you, Flora, including Sylvia, our another co-president. She'll also be joining us today. So what to expect in these sessions? They're recorded, so they'll be shared on YouTube later, and you can watch out for an announcement on Twitter or our IMBIS website. Or if you're here, then you've registered, so you'll also receive an email with a link to the recording. And also, we do our best to record any resources that are mentioned. So if people have mentioned books, blogs, things like that, we do our best to record that and send that out to you afterwards. We have two ASL interpreters here today, and live transcription is enabled. So please take advantage of those services if they're helpful to you. The interpreters should be identified, but you can also pin their videos. And if there's anything else you need for accessibility, please feel free to message me directly and I'll do my best to help you out. The format is we start with a 15-minute presentation from our speaker, Pedro, on his work, followed by a 15-minute facilitated conversation. And then the last 15 minutes are our AMA. So we really invite you to, as questions come up for you, pop them in the chat. And throughout the whole first 30 minutes, we'll be watching the chat to curate those questions. And we'll open it up to the audience in those last 15 minutes. And just a note on vocabulary, we recognize that this is a wide audience. So if we're using names like MBE, you hear terms like that and you're not sure what that is, please feel free to ask. Pop it in the chat. And if there are people in the chat and you see that question and you have an answer, we would love for you to help each other out. So MBE, like in the title, IMBIS, is mind, brain, and education. And briefly, that is, you can think of that as the intersection of research from psychology, neuroscience, health, and education, and how that information can come together to inform and help real teaching and learning. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Pedro.
Okay, give me a second. I want to do a little magic trick, and it worked. Hi, my name is Pedro de Bruyckere. I'm also a scientist from Belgium. Hi, Floor. And I'm also working at the University of Utrecht. And that's the last thing job-related that I will say is that I was just asked by the Flemish government to start a What Works clearinghouse here in Belgium, closely related to what the EEF is doing, the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK. And then often I get the question, can you tell us what works in education? Yeah, but it's often the wrong question, because in education, not everything works and nothing works all of the time. And so I think it's a better question to try to answer what can work. It's the huge difference between evidence and proof. In mathematics, we have proof. In education and most of social sciences, we have evidence that something sometimes maybe will work better, or there's a bigger chance it will work better than in another thing. But for the first 10 years that I was a bit in the public domain, I tried to answer what does not work. If some of you have heard of me before, it's because of this book. Together with Paul Kirschner and Casper Hulshof in 2011, but this version is from 2015, we published the book Urban Myths About Learning Education, trying to tackle all the very popular myths in and about education. There's a whole section about neuromyths in the book, but also myths about policy, and the classics are in there. You have the learning pyramid, you have the learning styles. You've all heard about them before. Now, what we didn't expect when we wrote this book is that we would start receiving on a weekly basis new questions. Yeah, but you know, what about this? And what about that? And what about... So the result was that we wrote a second book with a very original title, More Urban Myths About Learning Education. And something changed between the two books. It's something that's lesser known about the books, but because we are here in a very nice setting, I want to share this with you. The first book, Urban Myths About Learning Education, was actually blind peer reviewed by 6 scientists. It's not something that we put a large emphasis on, but we didn't want to have any mistakes in a book. And also for us, important, we use 3 categories. One category is totally nonsense, total nonsense. The second category, nuanced. And the third category is we don't know, because there is no science saying it's incorrect or correct. And for instance, maybe a huge surprise for people who know Paul Kirschner, who is famous or infamous, choose your own adjective, for writing one of the major papers about why minimal guidance doesn't work. But if you check it in this book, you will see that the label is not a myth when we are discussing minimal guidance, but nuanced. Because one of the key starting points of our book is we don't want to write our own opinion. Because it's a very easy way, call something a myth and you can get rid of it. No, we always wanted to describe what the current status of science is. And Paul is in one side of the story and has very good arguments, but we have to admit that there are other people who have other arguments. So we describe the discussion in the book. But when we received so many questions, I have to admit, and it's me, I was starting to get afraid, because we never expected the book to become so big. It sold 10,000s of copies. It was translated in 7 different languages. There's still new language coming probably this year. And so we knew if we would write a new book, a lot of people would start checking it again. And I was so afraid to make a mistake. So this book was delayed by 1 year just because I wanted to be sure that there was not a mistake in the book. And of course, there is a mistake in the book. If you can find it, it's in the reference. There is one reference that's incorrect, but I won't tell you which one. In the second edition, it was corrected. Okay, now after this book, those 2 books, a lot of people started asking, yeah, but can you tell us what works? And again, I tried to explain, yeah, I can't do this, but I did write a book, The Ingredients for Great Teaching, with 10 chapters of things, about things we know that have a huge chance that can have a positive effect on learning. It's not about what works, but what can work. And the whole starting point of this book is to work evidence-informed. And evidence-informed is, for me, a very important evolution from evidence-based. With evidence-based, it was never intended this way, but a lot of people start thinking, oh, you will give us recipes. But even if you go to a chemist and you buy a medicine, a drug, you will get a leaflet with all the background information. Don't take this pill if you're pregnant, and maybe you will have a headache afterwards. And a lot of people who bought the books by John Hattie or Marzano, they thought, we don't need to read the leaflet. Why am I promoting evidence-informed? Because we as scientists, we don't know the students of most teachers. We have an idea of what can have an effect, but we don't know their context. So we as scientists, we can inform them this could work, but also say, but don't do this because then it doesn't work. Or if, for instance, when we are discussing dual coding, if your students are over 70, then there's a big chance that you have to forget everything about dual coding because there are other rules at that stage in life. Okay, now with evidence-informed books, there are two issues. One issue is, well, significant. I have to explain this, and this is based on an article that I'm very proud of, that I co-authored with David Daniel, but I've discovered nobody reads the article. But that's why I want to mention it today, because it's one of the best articles I've ever written. But it's a very interesting insight by David Daniel, not by me, but I was co-author. And if you're a scientist and you want to get your articles published, then it's great to have a new idea, trial it, randomized controlled trial, and then discover that your approach is better than another approach. Then you have a significant difference. Great, congratulations, you're in the money. Well, kind of. If you find that your approach is as good as another, actually for a lot of sciences, this is bad news, because there's a slighter chance that you will get published, and it's not the big new thing. But for a teacher, this is great news. If something is as good as something else, not significant better or worse, it means it's an extra tool for a teacher. So they can choose and pick something else to have some variation. And so we plead in that article to rethink significance when we are talking about practitioners, because sometimes there's a practical significance, and that's not the same as significance for a lot of scientists who want to survive as a scientist who needs to publish or perish. But there is a second thing. Often evidence-informed today is all about didactical approaches. And it's correct, there is also about motivation, there's a lot, but if you go to research ed meeting, and I really love research ed, and if you go to a lot of conferences, you will hear dual coding, cold calling, retrieval practice again and again and again and again. And it's good, repetition is also important. Spaced repetition is another example. Okay, but education is much, much more. And after those two first myth books, the plan was to do something easy. And that were my famous last words. That was the next step. This is our nightmare. And I say our nightmare, the psychology of creative teaching, because I co-authored it with Casper from also the myth books and Lise. And this book took 4.5 years to write. You know, in psychology, for the people who don't know psychology that well, Erik Erikson once said, crisis is an opportunity for growth. And if this is true, then for the past decade, psychology has grown a lot, because the past decade delivered many opportunities for growth, because since 2011, we have experienced the replication crisis in psychology. So a lot of classic studies, for instance, maybe you know that one, Daniel Kahneman always used to mention it. If you take a pencil, put it in your mouth cheeks will go up, you will feel better. If you never heard about this study, good for you, forget it immediately. If you heard about this, actually they tried to replicate the study 13 times and it failed 13 times. And so a lot of classic studies, the Stanford Prison experiment, actually they are off the table. And if you want to read much more about this, I don't want to promote my own books that much. Science Fictions by Stuart Ritchie is a great book about the replication crisis, and I can only advise anybody interested in science to read it. But we have a couple of famous examples in education. For instance, growth mindset, very popular. The difference between failure is an opportunity to grow and, you know what, I'm smart or I'm dumb. And those mindsets exist. They're not a myth. But the question is, does it work to work on this? In 2018, a meta-analysis showed that it's a small effect on average. And the important word is here average. And then a huge replication study. Carol Dweck actually took part in this replication, checked it with enough students, but because most of the original studies were with very small samples. And when they checked it with a lot of students, 11,000 students, then they found no effect on average. But from other studies, we know that sometimes a growth mindset approach in education can even have a negative effect. But now it's getting interesting, because if on average there's no effect, and with some groups, for instance, older students, stronger students, then there is a possible negative effect, then you also can know that with some students, there is a significant positive effect. So don't throw it away just yet. If you're working with children from a lower social economic background, well, then it can have a positive effect. If you work with younger children, it can have a positive effect, a small but significant positive effect. This is an example of working evidence-informed, but now I didn't put the emphasis on the effect size. I never mentioned the effect size. I put an emphasis on the leaflet. Another example, a positive example, because that's often overlooked. When we are talking about the replication crisis, a lot of people put an emphasis on everything that's bad. But for instance, in cognitive psychology, 3 out of 4 studies were successful replication studies. So if you have a replication study or a lot of replication studies, and it's proven again, then this insight comes out stronger than ever. And for instance, the whole phonics versus whole language discussion, when we are discussing how people should learn to read, that's one of the examples that we have 100 years of reading wars and replications. Now, what we tried in our book, The Psychology of Creative Teaching, is trying to give an overview of everything, not only cognitive psychology, but every kind of element of psychology that's relevant or that can be relevant for teaching, and check if it's still standing. Now you start to imagine why it took 4.5 years to write this. But I've got great news. Oh, this slide is something went wrong with it's in Dutch, but I'll translate it. The worst thing is, in a lot of fields of research, there's almost no replication studies being performed. And this slide is the most depressing slide I will share with you to end my little talk. And then it's give or take 15 minutes. You know, in educational sciences, I'm not talking about psychology or educational psychology, but I'm talking now about educational sciences. The good news is there is no replication crisis in the educational sciences. The reason why, there are almost no replication studies being published. What you see here in this slide is the evolution between 2010 and 2020, the amount of replication studies being published in the top journals for educational studies. And the good news is it doubled. It went from 0.15% to 0.30%. That's it. So the good news is, if you don't want to have a replication crisis, don't do replications. But then maybe you will end up with stuff that's not that correct. That was my little introduction. Over to you, Kristen.
Yes, thank you so much, Pedro. And I'll say that I've only seen you in hour-long segments, and it's quite the task to summarize your work in 15 minutes. So thank you for that. And I often describe presentations with you as making the audience laugh while they question everything they thought they knew. So thank you. So our first question, this is the guided discussion part. We welcome audience questions in the chat for the next section. The first question for you is, what's been the biggest, most impactful change that you've seen arising from the work that you do?
I could give you now a very scientific based and answer that my books made a huge impact and that learning styles are gone. The sad thing is they aren't. And for me, it's still trying to find a way to get people a new way of thinking. But there are two things that I've experienced for the past 2-3 years where maybe I've had some impact. The first thing is, for me, promoting an evidence-informed way of approaching education has, for me, it's a acknowledgement of the profession of teaching, because by going one step backwards as a scientist and saying, you know what, it's the teacher, it's the team, it's the school who is in control. They need to make the choice because they are the professionals. Well, for me, that's a very important change, because quite often we've had top-down approaches in a lot of regions that have been going, that I've been visiting the past 10 years. And it's not only me who has been doing this. I've mentioned other organizations, but I can see a new recognition of the professional that a teacher can be. And the second element, and that's the most personal one, I have been a teacher trainer for 21 years. And this is the last month for a while that I'm a teacher trainer, because I accepted to start a kind of what works clearinghouse in Belgium. And I received from 23 former students that they were very sad that I left the profession of teacher trainer because I meant so much for them. And for me, that's maybe the biggest impact I've ever had.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I can see some very rich questions coming up in the chat, so we'll just move through our planned questions here. Why do you think it is? What makes the translation from MBE research into practice so challenging?
There are a couple of reasons that I've seen, and I also translated a book by Dan William, and we had some sessions. We know each other, and we also had conversations about this before, and also with Dylan William. We talked about this kind of stuff, and quite often it's the translation part, because one of the things that you need to do is you have to not make it too jargony to when you discuss things. Quite often I feel it as when I'm putting out my scientist hat, that there comes a kind of distance immediately, because sometimes teachers think, yeah, but he's a scientist, he doesn't know how it's really like, or he's smarter than me. No, I'm not. And what I kept teaching, and I even kept teaching sometimes in secondary education a couple of times a year, so people could still recognize me as a teacher. But also, more important, I wanted to keep faces on the numbers, and wanted to keep enough recent examples of teachers struggling with some of the stuff that I'm saying, because I'm not a guru who wants to sell stuff. No, I'm just somebody who says this could work. But then it's as important to tell teachers when some things could go wrong, and sometimes it can something from out of the classroom. If your students come from a horrible gym class, I'm not saying that gym classes are horrible, but sometimes you can have horrible gym classes and they enter your classroom and you are ready for retrieval practice. Good luck. But that has nothing to do with retrieval practice. It just has to do with the previous class, for instance.
Yeah, thank you for that. So in line with that, what do you think, what supports are needed or what could help teachers to actually implement this research in their classrooms?
The magic word is time. Because in most countries that I know now, we have teacher shortages. And for me, for the most important thing for teachers to bloom is that they have peace of mind. And what I've seen lately is that teachers are doing a hell of a job, a great job, but a very demanding job. And when the job is very demanding and people are leaving the profession, then your mental bandwidth is limited. And what I often say, and I got this from a colleague here in Belgium, is a metaphor. What I often say to schools, to education professionals, remember what the people say in the airplane before liftoff. Before putting the mask on the child, make sure you have oxygen yourself. And sometimes I think that we have to make sure that in schools we have priorities and we can't do everything all of the time at once. For instance, the schools that work with my the ingredients for creative teaching, there are schools in the Netherlands who work with this book, and I beg them, pick one chapter only, try it, adapt it to your situation, but don't try the other stuff immediately because you won't get there. And I think time is the most important element, but I know it's very hard because waiting with other stuff to do, then it's chances that are not being used, but you can't do everything all of the time.
Yes, very true. So we'll move on to our last curated question. And this is one of the great opportunities with INBIS is we really want to encourage this communication between teachers, practitioners, and researchers. So rather than the more standard researchers talking to teachers, we want to flip that and ask, what are some areas you think it would be great for researchers to be focusing more on, either just from your perspective as a researcher, but also possibly from a practitioner lens?
Well, there are I would like to mention two things. Since 2019, we've seen a new trend focusing on collective teacher efficacy. And we know now that collective efficacy can have a huge impact on learning. Now, in 2021, I think it was 2021, I wrote a little chapter in Dutch, so it's not that easy to find. But also, John Hattie wrote a book about collective student efficacy. And for the past decade or longer, we have had a huge attention to individualization, differentiation, personalization. And maybe unconsciously, this was even fueled by neuroscience, because interaction between groups is something that's much more difficult to examine. For sure, you can't put 20 people or 20 students in a scanner, for instance. But as we see now that the collective belief that we as a team, as a group, can make the difference, then it's interesting to try to find the mechanisms that can make the collective so good. And I think that's for us a whole new field of possible research. And a second, and one of my students just did a study on this, and we are trying to make it into an article. We all know the link between well-being and motivation, and we know learning, and we know that learning often will lead to well-being, vice versa too, but the link is often that learning will lead to well-being. But a very interesting insight from a review study by Fu and colleagues from 2021 showed that the link between, a very important link between achievement and well-being is perceived performance, the way that students perceive their own performance. And while this seems so logical, when we try to examine what perceived performance is, and if people have written a lot about this and done a lot of research about this, then we found it's not that much. So that's a whole field to examine. So that are two suggestions.
Fantastic, thank you. We have some very rich questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do is just start in the order that they came in. I'll read the question out, but I invite the people who wrote it, if there's anything that I get wrong or anything you want to add, please do jump in. So the first thing is thinking about the replication studies, and is perhaps the question not how many replication studies can be done, because it's nearly impossible to have the same parameters in educational contexts, but rather what works for who, when, where, and perhaps most importantly, why?
Yeah, of course. Still, I do think that replication studies often can, if you follow the same protocol, if you follow the same rules, I think it's good to do this, and then do it in a way that has been done in psychology, not over and over again, but 12, 13 replication studies, and then we have an idea. On the other side, there are different kinds of replication studies. Some follow the perfect protocol, but the replication study that I mentioned with growth mindset, it didn't follow the exact protocol because they didn't use the same small sample, but they used a huge sample, making it more relevant to check exactly that question. When does it work? For who does it work? And this is always very interesting to check. But I do think that the basis of replication studies still remains important.
Fantastic. Tracy, anything to add or follow up?
No, I was just diving, mentally into that other point about collective efficacy, and I really love that idea. And I think a lot of things happened post-COVID that sort of pointed to exactly that. So I really think you're onto something there. I love that idea.
Well, if you work on this, don't forget my name. Just kidding.
Okay, we have a lot of really rich questions here. So the next one, again, please feel free to unmute and add anything if there's anything I've missed. But what are your thoughts about using the learning engineering approach in the classroom? Working from David Daniels' idea of evidence generating instruction, I think we can design our lessons with data instrumentation to understand what works for which learners, which context, and which content.
I agree, but I also know the limitations. That's something that hasn't been mentioned in my talk a couple of minutes ago, and most of my work that I've been doing on this hasn't been published in the open. But for the past couple of years, I've worked on some projects about data literacy for educators, and I do think that's a very important new domain, because we have learning analytics, we have a lot of data being produced, but quite often one of the most important steps in data collection is overlooked. And the first step is, what do we want to know? Asking questions before we start collecting. Quite often in education, we collect now a lot of data, and then we have a pile of data, and then we try to find something in the data. But then you can have spurious correlations. Then it's much more interesting to teach schools. And I deliberately say schools, because you can't leave this to a single teacher. You have to have a kind of overview. But we need to learn them how to ask the right questions. So also to give more time, because now in a lot of schools, I know for sure in Flanders, but also in the Netherlands, don't know how it's in other countries, we collect a lot of data and teachers write a lot of stuff down. But quite often, to what extent? They collect data, they have a pile of data, but they don't do anything with that data. So asking a question first, then know what kind of data do we know. It will also limit a lot of the time teachers have to spend on paperwork, because then you can have a fixed focus, and then try to answer the question. If we do it like this, I think that would be a much better approach. But then we need a lot of elements of training to school teams to learn how to ask the right questions. Then we need to have kind of data analysis tools that are not too complicated, because you know what, I like working with SPSS, but I've learned that I'm one of the few people who likes this. And now I see some people smile. I feel you will have a team together. And then interpret the results, because that's also a very important step, that things can go wrong. So I agree, but then we need a couple of important steps to do in education.
And any follow-ups there?
Yeah, just your thoughts about qualitative data, because that's something that I think that innately teachers develop a sense for qualitative data, but they're not really trained on how to collect that type of data and how to analyze it, and then what do I do with it? What do I do next? You know, how to close that loop.
Correct. And why I started using quantitative data, but actually, if you look at what teachers write down in the student, I don't know what the word, we have systems where students are being followed, and teachers actually write stuff down. They don't give grades, but they write down that student acted today like this. That's also qualitative data. But that's now just a personal opinion. People often underestimate how good and needed qualitative research is, but they often underestimate how difficult it is to do a good job. I noticed with my students that do their thesis with me, they always say, oh, I want to do qualitative studies because that's easy. And then say, think again.
And I just want to make sure you know that you got an amen for that question in the chat. So you've got some like-minded colleagues in here. A few more quick questions for you. Well, the answers are, the questions are quick. The answers can be as long as you like, but this is an interesting one about enhancing teacher effectiveness. So is there value in shifting our training away from teaching and more toward learning? From my experience, teachers know very little about learning, and what they know has been debunked.
In the old continent where I'm living, you have people who are pedagogues, and pedagogues in the Anglo-Saxon world could be translated more as a kind of educational philosophers. And they complain about the important emphasis that has been put on learning in education. Because by putting the emphasis on learning, you put the emphasis on the child, on the student, on the learner. And a lot of the things that teachers need to do is all about teaching. And that's in fact about controlling the environment, if you're a social constructivist, or maybe cognitivist, or even just controlling everything when you're a behaviorist. But I do think if you look at a lot of the stuff that we mentioned that I mentioned, like retrieval practice, we need to teach the students this before they can apply it themselves. And if we think they will learn it by themselves without teaching, then I think if I look back to a couple of studies, then inequality in education will rise, because we know that some students will get it and others don't. Now, the answer is we need to teach our teachers both, but more important, show them the connection between both. Show them the connection between how people learn and why, for instance, in a good textbook, there is repetition. And I think that's the important part. If you only focus on the teaching, then you make it more instrumental. And sometimes I've noticed that a lot of people hate direct instruction. And I'm mentioning direct instruction with capital D and Y, referring to Siegfried Engelmann. And that's very structured, and sometimes people think, yeah, teachers become robots if they apply this kind of teaching. They shouldn't. But it's very important, like if you work with if you look at the work by Barak Rosenstein, the overview of the 10 principles, then you see already a bit of the connection between teaching and learning. And I think we should have an emphasis not on teaching or learning, but on the connection between the both of them.
Thank you, Timothy. Yeah, Timothy, anything to add? Any follow-up?
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. I lead a university, and we have a teaching and learning center. And what I've learned is that a lot of faculty do not really appreciate being told that they need to work on their teaching, or I don't know, they take that very personally. And what I find is a way to improve teaching. Faculty like to learn. Can we expose them more to how students learn, and then they indirectly improve their teaching? It's a backdoor approach, but rather than focusing on their teaching, I think there's a lot to be learned in the cognitive neurosciences, and I think that might improve their teaching. Your thoughts?
I agree, and there are two ways that there are two other backdoors that I sometimes use. The first one is modeling, and also explaining afterwards what you've done, to show them that you yourself have been teach as you preach, but also your own struggles. I think that's one backdoor. And a second possible backdoor is one of the more effective ways of professional development is let them observe each other. And I know that's even a bigger step, I know, but there are three important benefits of this kind of visitations. First one, the one who is visited by other teachers or professors will get better. The second benefit is the professors or teachers who observe will get better. The minimal amount of profit is that they know I won't do it like that. That's also a profit. But the third reason, and that's a very important reason, has everything to do with collective teacher efficacy. Because when teachers know about each other, how they teach, they will get closer to each other in approach, and this gives a bigger collective teacher efficacy. And that's why this could be such an important third backdoor.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, we are in our final 2 minutes. So I don't see, I think everything in the chat has already been asked. So any other questions? If anyone wants to just unmute and ask a new question or follow up on anything that's been said, we have 1 minute.
I did have one more question in the chat. I don't want to in any way imply learning styles. I want to talk about learner variability. And I find that so much of the research is on learning reports means, and there's no mean student. So I rarely see research that disaggregates by learner needs or learner experience or learner culture, to really understand which learning interventions are useful in which situations.
Now, I agree. I do think one of the, and now I'm really referring to my good friend Paul Kirschner. I think one of the important differences between students is their prior knowledge. And that's a very good starting point, because when you start to acknowledge that people have different prior knowledge, well, that already makes a huge difference. But there is one thing, and I want to hijack this question. I do agree completely, and I understand that it has nothing to do with learning styles. But I do think that we have put a lot of emphasis on differences, not in learning sciences, but in education as a whole. The element of collective is another element that was overlooked because of this. And I do think we need to have differentiation, and we need to have the collective. But one of the biggest challenges is that by putting an emphasis on differences, sometimes we make inequality bigger, and that's a huge challenge. That was a study performed by Jan Maskelyne and Mart Simons. We often introduce personalized education as a means to fight inequality, but actually there's a big chance we have the opposite effect. And there is one possible remedy, and that's a very nice closing element to add. And my colleagues from the NRO in the Netherlands made a report, a practical guide about this. It's important to have high expectations for everybody, and what your expectations are for a student can be very different to another students. But make sure that for every single student you're working with, that you have high expectations. And then you have the combination of, you have high expectations for everybody, so you don't have a self-fulfilling prophecy effect. But do bear in mind that what you can expect from somebody can be different, but make sure they are high enough.
So a wonderful note to end on. Pedro, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to put your website in the chat just to make sure people know where to find you. Is there anything else that you would like us to share? Any other contact information?
No, it was great fun, but it went so fast.
I know, they're so quick, but we're so glad that you could be here, share your work with so many more people, and excellent questions. Also, this community, I hope that you make connections with one another, some great minds in the room, and I really appreciate everyone being here. We will send out advertisements for our next AMA, which will be August 31st with Dr. Fumiko Heft, who is a dyslexia neuroscience researcher. So hope to see you there. But Pedro, thank you so much.